So far, China has been reluctant to exercise its military power abroad, which many in the West and Japan treated as a sign of weakness. So when do you think China would eventually exercise its military power abroad to solve international issues? For example, the current situation in Iran.
First of all, in a philosophical sense of the word, China throughout the ages never want to use war as the preferred way of solving country to country or state to state questions. War should always be treated as a last resort. So war should always be very, very carefully thought about and should always be the last resort rather than the first resort. Because if war breaks out, you're talking about loss of life, destruction of property, and once you launch a war, you never know whether eventually you will win the war or lose the war. So I think, philosophically speaking, China always looks at war as the last resort. And if possible, we want to avoid war. We want to bypass war. We want to use peaceful means to resolve problems. And we want to emphasize win-win possibilities rather than looking at anything or everything as a zero-sum game. Therefore, the fact that China does not want to use war to solve problems doesn't mean China is weak. As a matter of fact, if you look at the conflict between China and India, the two countries decided not to use military weapons. So we use fists, for example, sticks, for example. It doesn't mean that either China or India don't have heavier dosage, hardcore weapons. And then in China-Filipino clashes, we use water cannons, etc. It doesn't mean China does not have very strong, powerful naval powers to defeat the Filipinos. No. We do have, but we do not want to use them. We want to use more peaceful ways to solve the problem. We want to emphasize to the Filipinos that if you look at the American-Spanish Treaty of 1898, you should come to your own conclusion, which is in your best interest. Is that right? So I think going forward, whether China will be much stronger, more powerful than it is now, I believe China will never use war as the top choice.
But then wouldn't that require the rest of the world to have the same outlook? Like, is China trying to pull the world more into a more peaceful kind of function where people don't turn to war? Because a lot of people would say at the moment the United States still uses weapons, and I mean, they just kidnapped the leader of Venezuela. And a lot of Chinese even felt like China should do something. Now, I believe it's not a good idea. I agree with you. But a lot of people, including Chinese, think China should do more. At the moment, is being peaceful enough?
Well, being peaceful will be very important. However, if you are peaceful based on a very weak situation, like, for example, Venezuela, or even like Iran today, then you need to be prepared to probably suffer the brutal force from the United States or from Israel, for example. So I think the key issue you need to face is how you really look at issues involving war versus peace. And I hope you will always look for peace rather than using war. Secondly, you need to really build up your own strength. Now, having enough strength doesn't mean you need to use war as your preferred methodology. Having enough strength, as China does, gives us more luxury of demanding peace, because I think the United States already realized that they will never win a conventional war. The United States military, since the end of the Korean War in the early 1950s, already say the United States never wants to find itself in another ground battle against China, because they know the Chinese soldiers will be very ferocious and we will never tolerate a defeat at the hands of our enemies. I think ever since the victory parade on September the 3rd, 2025, the American decision makers probably also came to the conclusion they do not want to have a naval war against China, because China's shipbuilding capacity is now more than 260 times than the American shipbuilding capacity. And they also do not want to have an air war against China. Why? Because many of the so-called phantom warplanes or bombers of the United States can be seen through thoroughly by the Chinese radar, because the Chinese radar is the most sophisticated in the world. They can detect any plane from their takeoff until their landing. And for the B-2 bombers or whatever, they claim to be stealthy or they cannot be detected by radar. They can be fully detected. So in time of war, they will be really sitting duck to be shot down very easily. So I think the Americans and the United States has been talking about the sixth generation of fighter planes. They are still doing something on the drawing board. China is about to deploy the real sixth generation of fighter planes. So I think the Americans hopefully will, for their own benefit, come to the conclusion having a war against China is futile. Don't talk about a war with China. Talk about peace. Talk about working together with China for the benefit of the Chinese people and the American people, as well as for mankind as a whole. That is what I call the inevitability of peace. The Americans talk about death and paying tax as two things inevitable. I said, now you have a third inevitability. That is peace with China is inevitable. And this is for the mutual benefit of China and the United States.
抖音